So this video is looking at the myth of the lost cause, how after the Civil War, the South basically tried to change the narrative and make it seem like they were fighting to preserve states' rights.
For the losing side of a war to have monuments.
Guess what else is real rare in world history? The whole way we ended the Civil War.
But those statues take on a really charged feeling for people.
Okay, real quick, wanted to point out a lot of these statues were put up like way after the Civil War. Some of these statues were put up like in the 1900s, and it's basically a way of the South asserting dominance and showing people that were like anti-slavery that they still have the power to put up these monuments celebrating like key figures in the Civil War.
We have a clash around memory and heritage and what it means with regard to the American Civil War.
Civil wars usually end with the losers going to the hangman's noose, the guillotine, to prison, to exile, or something. And in this case, they just went home.
Okay, what's interesting with that is not only did the South like just go home or just like nothing really happened after the war, you see them being like celebrated in a lot of textbooks. You see this narrative being pushed about them being in the right.
In America today, almost half the country believes that the Civil War was about states' rights. But the historical record shows that the Civil War was about slavery.
You can pull up like the secession documents of different states, and they're outlining clearly that it's about slavery. And when people say, if they say it's about states' rights to do what? States' rights to continue practicing slavery.
Talk to 𝙊𝙩𝙝, the former president of the Museum of the Confederacy, to get some answers.
Was slavery the principal cause of that political dispute? Yeah. There's no way to deny that.
Okay, real quick, a lot of historians have been saying that. Historians have been pointing out when you look at the documents, it was completely about slavery. If it was about states' rights, then the South wouldn't have been pushing for the Fugitive Slave Act, in which Northerners were being pressured against their will to basically turn in people who had been enslaved and ran away. So a lot of this has to do with the South trying to like reclaim like their ancestors who fought in the Civil War and trying to put them in a positive light and make it seem like they were actually like patriots instead of traitors.
Southerners' documented defense of slavery and white supremacy into a patriotic defense of the Constitution. The Civil War had devastated the country, leaving those who had supported the Confederacy grasping to justify their actions. Many pro-Confederate writers, political leaders, and others were quick to...
Okay, so again, that phrase that she uses, like they're grasping to justify their actions, like immediately after the Civil War, it seemed pretty clear that the South was in the wrong. And so they basically tried to influence public opinion to make it seem like those fighting for the South were every bit as good as those fighting for the North. And it's crazy how effective this has actually been.
Adopt and spread the narrative of the lost cause. One organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, played a key role in transmitting the ideas of the lost cause to future generations.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do this. It's called lateral reading, where we go and look and see what other sources are saying about a group. So you have, this is encyclopedia.virginia.org. So you have United Daughters of Confederacy. They're formed in 1894 to protect and venerate Confederate memory. So again, they're basically trying to preserve like the memory of their ancestors and trying to put their ancestors in a positive light. Okay, descendants of Confederate veterans, they aided the Confederate cause, directed most of the efforts for raising funds for Confederate modern monuments, advancing a correct history. Notice they put correct in these quotation marks. Like a lot of historians wouldn't say that it was correct, but it's basically like they're trying to make the history of their ancestors look positive. Talks about you have another group, Children of the Confederacy. Context of these efforts was the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War, which emphasized states' rights and secession over slavery. Again, you can look at the documents of some of the first states to break away, and it's very clear that it was all about slavery. That's what I'm showing you right here. So this is South Carolina Declaration of Secession. So they break away, And that highlights right at the beginning. So it's saying that basically she should declare the immediate causes which led to this act. So they're laying out the causes of like why South Carolina tries to break away right at the beginning. An increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations and laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So right at the beginning, they're outlining hostility towards slavery. Okay, they basically talk about how these states aren't following the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, if you read the full thing, it's like completely outlining that it's about slavery. If you look right here, talks about like a war being waged against slavery until it shall cease to exist. Slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection. The federal government will become the enemy. So again, this idea that some try to say of like states' rights, it just does not add up. Okay, let's keep going with Daughters of the Confederacy.
United thousands of middle and upper-class white Southern women. The UDC raised thousands of dollars to build monuments to Confederate soldiers. These were often unveiled with large public ceremonies and given prominent placements, especially on courthouse lawns. The daughters also placed Confederate portraits in public schools.
Okay, real quick, think about that if you have it on courthouse lawns. These are supposed to be public areas. Everyone's tax dollars are going toward it. So you have people that are the descendants of slaves, and they then have to look at Confederate monuments in like public property.
They monitored textbooks to minimize the horrors of slavery and its significance in the Civil War, passing revisionist history and racist ideology down through generations. By 1918, the UDC claimed over 100,000 members. As their numbers grew, they increased their influence outside the South. Presidents William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson.
Okay, what they're about to bring up, this is crazy for basically Southern like soldiers who fought in the Civil War, for them to be at this cemetery with other soldiers who fought to defend the country is wild, when these guys were fighting to try to like form a new country.
Both met with UDC members and enabled them to memorialize the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery. The UDC still exists and defends Confederate symbols as part of a noble heritage of sacrifice by their ancestors. Despite the wealth of primary sources,
a noble heritage of sacrifice. A noble heritage of sacrifice is how the UDC tries to frame it.
Showing that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War, the myth about states' rights persists today. In the aftermath of the war, Frederick Douglass and his abolitionist contemporaries feared this erasure of slavery from the history of the Civil War could contribute to the government's failure to protect the rights of Black Americans, a fear that has repeatedly been proven valid. In an 1871 address at Arlington Cemetery, Douglass said, "We are sometimes asked in the name of patriotism to forget."
Okay, real quick, he brings up a point basically that you can't conflate the South and the North. And if you're basically indicating that the two are the same, it's like, what was the point of the Civil War? So he is more of the idea, Douglass is more has the idea that you need to really like spell out what the Civil War was about. And the kids need to really like understand it, or students really need to understand it.
The merits of this fearful struggle, and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?
Okay, so again, that idea, it's saying like, if people don't remember what the Civil War is about, like, will they really remember like slavery and how bad it actually was? So again, just to summarize, that's the myth of the lost cause, in which you have basically people of the South, those whose ancestors had fought in the Civil War, trying to basically put the South in a positive light and trying to make it seem like they were fighting for a noble cause for states' rights, and that it wasn't really about slavery.